every day, the legal landscape shifts in ways that can redefine people's rights. Courts pass judgments that create history. In today's episode, we decode a few of the most important judgments passed in the first quarter of this year.
Thanks, Sandhya. I truly believe that this year so far has been a landmark period for Indian jurisprudence. There were very important legal developments for protection, in fact, on the gender rights. In Jan 2026, if you see, there's been a major boost to gender justice, and the Supreme Court has declared menstrual health as a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution. So it is just not on a sanitation issue. The court has ruled that the access to menstrual hygiene is, in fact, a fundamental aspect of human dignity under Article 21, directing the states to ensure free sanitary products in all government schools. So, this, in fact, is a welcome step, and it will ensure dignity for a lot of young girls and ensure that menstruation will not become a barrier for their education.
Absolutely.
And the government also has directed the schools, government schools especially, to put in place certain standard operating procedures. In fact, to stock and to make available free sanitary pads for the use by the girls who are studying in these schools, and in fact, to provide effective disposable facilities of the same, and also to educate the boys about the girls' menstruation. So I think these are extremely very practical and welcome steps which has been taken by the Supreme Court.
Yeah. The social taboo about menstruation is finally going, and the Supreme Court has actually aided that. Subathra, here it is important to note the distinction between menstrual health and menstrual leave. Okay. Now, the Supreme Court, which ruled that menstrual health was a fundamental right, actually declined to make it mandatory for corporates to provide 1 to 2 days of paid menstrual leave for women. One would have thought, why the dichotomy? But in fact, I personally believe that it was a very objective call, because the Supreme Court was concerned about a hiring bias, especially private institutions. They may not want to hire women by also paying them, giving them paid leave, and also not letting them work. So that was one of the major concerns. And also, I believe it would have looked at menstruation as an illness, which it is not. It is just a cycle of nature. Right? So there is a very important distinction that the Supreme Court ruled in 2 separate but related judgments.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sandhya. Sandhya, if you look at the month of February, there was an epic fury as the world witnessed the US-Israel's war against Iran, right? So even as the world is debating whether such strikes was an act of self-defense or a violation of the principles of the UN Charter, I think the Indian government swiftly put the legal machinery into play to deal with the looming energy crisis, which is, of course, still ongoing.
Right.
Now, the government of India had plugged in the Essential Commodities Act, which was invoked to prioritize the CNG and LPG distribution, especially to the households, while industrial sectors and fertilizer plants were legally capped at 65 to 70% of their requirements, right? Now, the new regulations also has increased the mandatory waiting period for LPG refills from 21 to 25 days to prevent any kind of panic buying and black marketing as such. The third most important thing is recruitment agencies were also legally barred from deploying Indian seafarers to the vessels passing through the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman. And the other notable factor is the government also temporarily relaxed certain environmental regulations to allow the hospitality industry to use biomass and firewood as a legal fuel source for 1 month to offset the gas shortage as such.
Subhadra, while relaxing certain environmental regulations, the Supreme Court laid down stern rules in another aspect of the environment, most important one, namely waste management. Now,
Right.
municipal bodies and corporations were informed that waste management failure will now be treated as a criminal breach of the right to a clean environment, and not view it as only an administrative lapse. Now, obviously, this stems from the 2024 Supreme Court judgment. In fact, I remember in our verdict article, we had covered this, wherein the Supreme Court laid down that a clean environment is a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution because it enables people to live with health and dignity.
So, Sunday, in the month of March, if you see, it is more of a watershed month at the Supreme Court where that passed following judgments. The one was on the first passive euthanasia for a young man who was in a permanent vegetative state for about 13 years, right? And 15 years after the Supreme Court recognized passive euthanasia as a valid mode for providing a dignity to death. And it is a very progressive judgment which the court has ruled out with such a sensitive decision. And it should be a very holistic assessment of the patient as such. So I think these are extremely important judgment which has come out in the month of March, especially to have a very dignified death.
True. This is probably one of the most poignant cases that the Supreme Court has dealt with. In fact, when I was reading the judgment, it was also emotional, you know. As you said, the court has reiterated that such cases must be dealt with a holistic assessment of the patient, but also the wishes of the patient and the family's wishes, and just taking into account the futility of just existing biologically with no possibility of improving any quality of life whatsoever. Now, the case that you were talking about, it was decided on the 11th of March 2026. Thereafter, the family swiftly moved. The patient was moved to the palliative care or end of life care in AIIMS, Delhi. Now, under the supervision of expert medical teams, nutrition and fluids were gradually withdrawn, and also to ensure that the patient felt no pain. Okay, palliative care medication was given to ensure that he felt no pain whatsoever or any respiratory distress. So, on 24th March, the patient passed away naturally and peacefully. Now, the Supreme Court ensured that the patient died with dignity. This is what the judgment has done. The Apex Court also reiterated alongside the need for framing an end of life care act and has urged the government to undertake the same, put in a guidelines and make it a legislation on priority.
So, a single court's decision can change the narrative not only for businesses or for an industry, but for the people in general. So, the Indian Supreme Court has been very proactive, objective, and progressive in passing judgments that focus on a range of issues, right from gender, ensuring dignity in death, to wartime protection and institutional accountability for the larger benefit of the society. So at the lottery, we keep track of these key judgments, legislative policies, and also we are very happy to share these profound impacts to the society. That is why law matters. Keep watching this space for more.